Welcome to episode 2 of Discernment Straight Up. I'm Father Nicholas Pearce.
And I'm Jaycee Napoles.
And this is a free and frank conversation about
discernment, and particularly to the diocesan priesthood.
You're going to finish my sentences all episode?
Because we have a lot of chemistry, that's why.
Very warm welcome to those of you who are watching us live via YouTube and those of you who are following on the podcast or watching a replay later on. We're making our way through Father Brett Brannan's book To Save 1,000 Souls as we're looking at this really important question about discernment and discernment of a diocesan priestly vocation.
And what it looks like, especially for young men these days.
Which is, JC, a little bit closer to you than it was to me. You're a 6-year seminarian here in the Archdiocese of Melbourne, and you're preparing for diaconate ordination later in the year.
Yes, indeed. And, while reading this book, I found out I'm actually dating.
Wow.
Dating.
Engaged, I think, would be at this point, preparing for marriage.
That's actually quite profound.
So tonight's topic is, of course, we're looking at the whole question of celibacy and chastity, which is really interesting because he doesn't address it until chapter 13 of the book.
Yeah, that was actually quite interesting.
But in the reading program, the Melchizedek project that we're working through, he brings it up in episodes 6 and 7 or session 6 and 7. So I wonder whether he's sort of changed his own understanding of that. But I think it speaks to us of the fact that it's important, but he doesn't see it important enough to put it in the first 12 chapters of the book. But when he's talking to college students about it and giving them an opportunity to discuss with each other about it, he brings it a lot further forward in the book. So I think it's important, and it's obviously such a topical matter on the minds of young men who are thinking about vocations. But for us who are priests, and for those of us who are helping young men in their discernment, it's important that we help everyone put it in the context of a broader vocation. And whilst it's an important part of our discernment process, it can't be the only thing that we think about.
It definitely is not the only thing we think about.
Now,
but when discerning myself, it was like the second or third question I would have to ask.
Yeah, I was going to say, trying to tell a university-age man not to think about sex is like trying to tell a thirsty man in the desert not to think about water.
Yeah.
Good analogy?
Oh, excellent analogy.
It's great. We're going to start off. We've said that the whole podcast is discernment straight up because we're standing up, and it's important to have these conversations in an open and frank manner. So we do think it's important to have the conversation about celibacy and chastity and what it means, and to have it in a pretty open and frank manner. So, JC, what about for you? When you started your journey in the seminary all those years ago, how important was it for you, and was it a hurdle for you to jump over this question of lifelong celibacy?
That's a very tough question to ask, but it was a conflicting topic when discerning. It's because we're all young men at one stage, and the only thing we can think about is to have our own families. And I love children, I love kids, and one day I had dreams of having a family of my own. But when the Lord calls you, I think He gives you a lot of grace, and He gives you a lot of clarity in that sense to move forward, and to ask you the question whether are you willing to give up something which is good, having sex, family, marriage, and children, for something which is quite supernatural.
And one of the really important things that Father Brett addresses in his chapter is the fact that we're being asked to give it up, but we're generally now asking young men to give it up from a place of woundedness. And that even more so for this generation than for your generation and for my generation before it, young men are coming to the question of discernment and to vocation with a wounded sexuality. The world in which we live is changing the view of everybody about sex and sexuality. So by the time a guy gets to his early 20s and he starts the discernment process, he's starting it from a very different place than perhaps priests of 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago. And he uses the word abuse quite specifically, and he speaks about the fact that there's a higher proportion of young men out there who have experienced direct abuse as a child, and that's going to affect their view of their own sexuality going forward. But also then he just speaks about the fact that sexuality as a whole is abused more generally, and therefore we all suffer the effects of this wounded sexuality, which makes the question of discernment and then coming into celibacy a whole lot harder.
Yeah, you mentioned firstly about abuse, and especially this day and age, I think we're more capable of pinpointing situations in our lives where abuse has occurred. Mm-hmm. And with that awareness, although what comes out of it is a sense of brokenness, but because we are aware of it, we can do something about it. And about the world as we know it, it's that culture that espouses sexual promiscuity, and a lot of sexual disorders will come out of that.
And I think one of the things he points out, though, is that no matter how bad or how wounded a young man might be, that he shouldn't give up hope, and that God's grace is a remarkable thing, and that if we need to get over the sense or this wounded, again, even our view of ourselves becomes wounded. That if we carry the wounds of a particular area, then we're particularly bad, and we can never be redeemed. We can never be saved, and we can never flourish. But he speaks about the fact that it's really important for us to realise that if we're struggling with an area of our sexuality that is wounded or abused, as he speaks about it, that's going to be a problem in our vocation no matter what it is. So part of our responsibility in discernment of vocation and helping people who discern their vocation, but part of the responsibility for every young man is to try and heal those wounds. And this follows for young women as well, especially if they're thinking about marriage or religious life as their vocations, but that the wounds that we carry aren't only going to affect us if we choose to be celibate. And he addresses one of those big myths, especially when it comes to the question of things like pornography and self-abuse or masturbation, where a lot of young men think that once they get married, that as soon as they start having sex, that these problems are going to go away. But time and time again we see, and priests know this from our pastoral experience, we know it from our psychological research, we know it from the lived reality of married men around the world, that this isn't the case anymore. Oh, yes. That these things, especially if they're ingrained and they're never addressed by the man himself, he carries them long into his life.
Into his marriage, into his relationship.
Yeah, and it can do just as much damage there as it could for a man who's trying to carry them into the priesthood. So it's really important, I suppose, for all young men to tackle with the help of a spiritual director or a wise and trusted friend to tackle some of these issues before they move on to their vocation, but also not to lose hope. Because the biggest challenge is that if the devil gets in our ear and we think that we're not worthy of a vocation or we're not worthy of following the Lord's call, then we're never gonna follow it through.
It's always going to be a struggle, and the importance of it is asking for the grace to overcome those difficulties.
Yeah. We've celebrated this week the 100th anniversary of the birth of St. John Paul II, and Father Brannan makes reference to him and his theology of the body, which is a really wonderful gift that was given to the church by St. John Paul II. And if you haven't delved into that, and in particular some of those popular sort of editions of it, the great one by Christopher West, Good News About Sex and Marriage, addresses a lot of these sort of wounded parts of our sexuality and how we can start to seek healing in them. But he refers to it because he speaks about the fact that quite often he would ask, when he was a vocations director, he would ask young men the question, are you called to marriage or are you called to the priesthood? But the more that he delved into the work of St. John Paul II, he asked them the question, which marriage are you called to? Now, we had this chat before we started recording tonight, and you disagreed with this. And it's okay, you're allowed to disagree, and I'll disagree back with you. But what's your problem?
Well, I think we were discussing, I was telling you how I thought they were, they can't be compared. Because marriage between a man and a woman, produces, life. It produces a living being, and whilst a call to the priesthood produces a different life, but it's more of a spiritual life. a father becomes a father through biological means, by biological fatherhood. But a priest's fatherhood is a spiritual fatherhood. So when he's like, you're called to which marriage are you called to? I think it was unfair to compare the two equally.
Okay. I think with any analogy, it's never going to fit completely. So I tend to go with the authority and think that he's probably a little bit wiser and more well-read than us. But I think there's a real beauty in the analogy because, again, this idea of the priest and the church as being bride, and that we are espousing ourselves for life to the church, and that this takes a certain amount of freedom and a certain amount of faithfulness, and of course that great call to fruitfulness that we see in the sacrament of matrimony, the free, faithful and fruitful giving of ourselves to the church. And we see this time and time again in priests, especially this idea of fruitfulness. Priests should be striving to be fruitful, just like a husband and wife are. And it's my responsibility to bear fruit in the life of the church. Yes. And I can only do that if I am able to freely give myself, and I'm going to be faithful to the vows and the promises that I make. And we see it even on the day of ordination, that priests stand before the bishop, who is the representative of the church. And we stand on the same altar as brides and grooms do every other day, and we make our vows before the Lord. So I think it's really important. And I think back to this question of celibacy, this one of the most common refrains we hear is, well, I can't be a priest because I like girls too much. Or everyone says that I would be a good father, or I think I'd be a good father, and therefore I can't give these things up for being a priest. Well, the reality is the best fathers, the men who think they would make the best fathers are also the men who make the best priests. Because there is there needs to be this desire for a spiritual fruitfulness in the life of a priest.
And it's all about, it's about the desire, but you can also see that desire in the way fathers love their girlfriends and their future wives, and how priests love the church and love the ministry, love the people of God.
Yeah.
And
the analogy goes a bit further then, because he speaks about it in terms of dating. And our Archbishop here in Melbourne recently challenged the young men in the church here in Melbourne to date their vocation.
Yes,
to actually spend some serious time dating vocation. And Father Brennan in To Save a Thousand Souls speaks about it, and he speaks about this fact that we need to actually give ourselves over to a serious period of discernment where we date our vocation.
Yeah,
and
just to clarify, because I thought when he said date your vocation, like, to put like a date on it.
Well, I don't think that is necessarily completely incorrect in itself.
All right.
But we'll come back to that.
Yes.
I think he's speaking more in the romantic sense.
Yeah, I didn't realise that.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Well, there you go.
We all learn something new every day. So I suppose it was in the terms of that if we're encouraging every young Catholic man to spend some time actively discerning his vocation, that he can think of it as a date, or as dating a girl. Dating his future bride. Any Catholic man who's entering into sort of relationships with girls should be doing it in the sense that he's looking for his future bride. He's not just casually dating. He's not just speed dating. He's not Tinder dating. But he's searching for a bride, and that should be the focus of his Catholic sense of dating, and that can also be the sense of when we're looking at our understanding of the priesthood. I'm looking at the church, and I'm looking at this vocation as I would my bride. And I want to date it. I want to get to know it. And the same rules apply. If I'm dating a girl and I want to get to know her better, then I start looking at her exclusively. And this is a question that he addresses in chapter 13, is this question of, can I be dating other girls if I'm actively discerning my vocation?
Now, we did have a conversation about that on the dinner table, and it's that the short answer is no. Like, you can't discern your vocation to the priesthood as you are dating a woman. Like, it won't be first of all, it won't be fair to the woman, and it won't be fair to the church as well as yourself. Like, how can you be honest?
Yeah. And I think this is where your statement about dating your vocation comes into it. I normally recommend to guys that they spend a set period of time and they can put a date on it. So just like they would a girl, if they want to go steady, so to speak, or sort of be in a singular relationship with one particular girl, that they test it over a period of time. I think we guys should be doing that when it comes to the sense of a vocation to the priesthood as well. We can spend a period of time as young men thinking about all vocations: religious life, married life, priesthood, single life. But at one point or another, you should set aside a period of time, a set window, and actually date the vocation to the priesthood. And put some time and effort into it. And then as you do that, like you would a girl, if it becomes more and more apparent as you do it that this is what maybe God is calling you to do, then you spend more time. And it gets more serious. And this is where Father Brannan speaks about the role of the seminary. And he speaks about the fact that at the end of the day, we can't discern in a vacuum. We can't discern on our own. We must be ready at one point or another to seek the help of a spiritual director, a trusted priest, but then also the vocations director. So, and we spoke about the vocations director in the last episode, the important role that the bishop entrusts to the vocations director to help men discern. And that we trust that God's grace accompanies that process. That it's not just this priest giving his opinion, but he's been entrusted with this role by the bishop. So Father Brannan speaks about the fact that if okay, say I'm dating my vocation of the priesthood and it's becoming a little bit more serious, and through prayer and discernment, it's becoming apparent there's actually only so much further that relationship can go unless I am ready to make that step into
jump.
A seminary community. Can you remember what it was like when you moved into Corpus Christi College?
It was actually quite surreal because I went through the process of going to discernment retreats, going to Friday night meetings with the vocations director and seeing him regularly. And so he really prepared me for a diligent and a thorough discernment period until I ease on into the seminary, and it became very smooth. The seminarians were very welcome. They had all these smiles on their faces, I think because there's no assignments due. And entering into the seminary became very easy, and it produced in me a confidence, a certain clarity, and a certain confidence that I was making the right decisions. My dating became, instead of just going out here and there, became a serious dating, and an idea that maybe this is going to be permanent, not permanent in the seminary context, but a permanent life with the church.
And I think this is a really important point, is that we don't have to be 100% certain when we go into a seminary.
Yes.
No one is ever 100% certain when they step in the doors of the church. It's not, again, if we're going to carry the analogy all the way through, it's not the wedding day.
Yeah, it's a serious dating phase.
Yeah, and there needs to be a certain amount of certainty. We don't just accept anyone and everyone into the seminary, but again, this is where entrusting yourself to the discernment of the church and allowing the church to tell you whether or not you're ready or not is an important part of the process. But by stepping into the seminary, all we're doing is saying, I want to spend more time. I want to put myself in an environment that has been designed to help me discern, to help me to get to know my future bride better. And I'm going to do that by getting to know her family better and getting to know her history better and getting to know her teachings better and throwing myself into the life of this other so that I can grow in my appreciation of it. And again, like anyone, it becomes really clear and really apparent very quickly through the time in a seminary whether or not the love and the charity is growing. And this is where he also addresses this in chapter 13. At the very core of this question of celibacy is a question of charity. And that's why we can't address the question of celibacy and the celibate life if we don't address charity first. And so whilst it's an important thing for us to be discerning from very early on in our time in the seminary, it's not until we've actually grown in the life of love and grown in that relationship of love with our future spouse that celibacy makes sense. So for me, it probably wasn't until halfway through my 5th year. And we were talking about this last week. And that generally here in the church in Australia means after you've done a pastoral internship, which can either be 3, 6, 12 months, depending on the seminary. But it was only after I had spent this sort of intensive period of time living and working in a parish and really seeing the life of a priest and seeing it lived out on a daily basis that I really stopped questioning the choice of celibacy. And it had become apparent to me. And if I'd tried to know that before I'd even stepped in the doors of the seminary 4 or 5 years earlier, I never would have gone.
And what it does, well, I had that a few years ago for my pastoral experience. I had 6 months in the parish, and what it does, it affirms what you've been doing for the last 3 or 4 years in the seminary, as well as making you flourish in your life. When you spoke earlier about being fruitful, a seminarian and a priest faithful to their calling becomes quite fruitful, and they flourish in their vocation.
So there's a trick question, and this is one of the ones that we normally get from some young men as well, perhaps God's calling me to be a permanent deacon, where I can have the best of both worlds. I can be married and have a family of my own, and I can also minister as a deacon in the church, and I can assist at the liturgy, and I can proclaim the gospel, and I can preach, and I can assist at Holy Communion.
Yes. I think Father in his book calls it the compromise, the permanent diaconate as a compromise. But in the paragraph he says that it's quite insulting to see a permanent deacon as a compromise. In itself, it is a vocation, and even with the permanent diaconate, having a variety of things which are similar to priestly celibacy as well as married life. Within that vocation comes a different set of struggles.
Yeah.
And when a man is called to the permanent diacon, he also takes up a different cross. And to see it as the best of both worlds is quite ridiculous.
Yeah, and I think there's some really practical implications of it, at least here in the church in Australia, but in most parts of the world, men are only permitted to move towards the permanent diaconate much later in life. After they've been married, they've raised their children. So for a 22-year-old man to be sort of saying, okay, I think God might be calling me to something in 40 years' time, that's not generally how God works in the life of the church, nor in the life of any of the permanent deacons that I've met. It's a call that does come dated, if you know what I mean. It comes at a particular time in a man's life when he's called to serve the church later on. So yeah, I don't think it's necessarily it's definitely not the compromise position, but I also just wonder, at the end of the day, it is a little bit like, for a young man in particular, the thought of dating 2 girls at once. If God's calling you, and this is something that Father Brett speaks about in the book as well, at this stage in the life of the church here in Australia, here in the church universal, in the Roman rite of the church, celibacy and the diocesan priesthood go hand in hand. They're synonymous. If God's calling you to be a diocesan priest, he is calling you to be celibate. And therefore, the grace will come with that over time. And again, this comes back to that question about I don't have to have it all the day I walk into my first year in the seminary. That God's grace builds on our human nature over time.
Yes.
And the very building up of a seminary program is there to help you grow in your understanding of a whole variety of things. You don't have to know and completely comprehend the church's entire theological tradition or liturgical tradition or catechetical historical tradition by the first day of seminary.
No.
That's you're barely going to know it by the end of seminary, but the whole point is that you grow through. The seminary is from the Latin for seedbed, like you grow in your time in the seminary. And this also happens in the area of our sexuality and our understanding of our call to celibacy. So if you're feeling a call to the priesthood, but not feeling 100% confident in your ability to live celibacy out yet, that's actually a perfectly natural thing.
And he talks about this this progression into what he calls a sexually integrated life. And you learn how to integrate all aspects of your life to become a whole man, to become a man ready, who knows himself, is quite aware of his faults and weaknesses, but is willing to progress and to move forward, and to reach that level of maturity and integration.
And it's okay, he says, to feel the attraction to the priesthood and not fully comprehend it. And he says that's a sign of the fact that God has put it on your heart.
Yeah.
If you completely think you have an understanding of what it means to be a diocesan priest, and you've completely worked out absolutely everything about celibacy and obedience and simplicity of life, and that's a pretty good indicator that it's something that you've concocted in your own heart, your own mind. But if it's a calling and you don't quite understand it, I took 3 years of pushing my calling away as fast and as hard as possible because it came and I didn't want it.
Wow.
And I didn't want the celibacy and I didn't want the obedience and I didn't understand most of it. So I pushed it away and I ran away as far as I could. And I tried to find all of these other ways to make myself happy, none of which worked. Because at the end of the day, it was God's calling on my heart and I was never going to be able to escape it. And as soon as I actually, to a certain degree, abandoned myself to that call and actually said, you know what, Lord, okay, I've done everything else and now I'm going to discern this. Everything started falling into place.
Nice.
And it became abundantly clear that this is what God was asking of me in my life at this time. Now, did that mean that I knew what it meant to be a celibate and I completely understood it all and I was ready to commit myself to it? Not even close. Does it mean though, and he speaks about this in chapter 13 for those guys who are following along with the book, there needs to be a certain amount of mastery. Okay?
Yes.
And this is the role of the vocations director and vocations teams, your spiritual director, to help you discern what level of mastery is right for you. Again, knowing how many guys are coming to seminaries now dealing with things like pornography addiction or having been in previous sexual relationships or dealing with other forms of sexual wounds, there needs to be a period of abstinence and a period of sustained growth in the life of the man. But he goes through and points out how that is very different for every individual guy.
Yes.
And that as soon as we start again thinking that, well, I'm just too wounded to follow this, we're never going to get anywhere.
Yes. And he mentions the example of St. Thomas More, who joined a seminary, but discerned his way out of the seminary. And his famous quote was, he'd rather be a celibate layman than a impure priest.
Yeah.
And it's that sort of awareness that you get from committing your life to the Lord and him giving you the answers for you to sustain a life of sanctity.
But I think the point is that there needs to be a certain amount of commitment first. I need to actually test. I need to be able to test it with someone else first of all, a spiritual director, then with the vocations director, and then the policies and the procedures that are in place from vocations teams for then admission to the seminary. And then the seminary itself is a great testing ground for all things to do with a vocation. We're almost out of time, JC. Is there anything else that's on your heart on this important matter?
Oh yes, we spoke about those, who are sort of calling themselves to the priesthood, and they get there's a blurred sort of voice in their mind saying that, oh, you're called to the priesthood, but it's not really coming from God. It's actually coming from themselves. What are your thoughts on that, Father Nicholas?
Yeah, again, I think they don't last. I think, and we discussed this in episode 1, this question of putting things in their right order. Jesus' will first, the needs of others second, and then ourselves last. And this is where we're going to find joy. And any guy, at least in my time in the seminary, or even young men that I've helped sort of in the discernment process who have got that order wrong and put themselves and their own needs or their own desires first, and not particularly seeing the priesthood as an opportunity to serve the other, and in a very specific way to serve Christ and the church, they're the guys who never survive. And they sort of crash and burn. So again, this is where it is the role of seminary staffs and vocations officers to help these guys discern in and discern out, because sometimes these guys can a little bit like a ticking time bomb or a train wreck. They can do a bit of damage around them as well. So it's really important. And this is, again, where trusting in the role of vocations teams is really important, because we're not in the business of getting wrong guys into the seminary.
Yes.
We're not in the business of pushing guys into seminaries or onto ordination, because we know, and we've seen time and time again, the great damage that those kind of individuals can do to the life of the church. So,
one other thing, Father Nicholas. Now you've been a priest for over 10 years, I think.
Over 10 years,
Yes.
yeah, almost 10 years. 10 years
Almost
in
10 years.
September.
Excellent. What has been your go-to place or go-to mode of sustaining your celibacy or to making it this far?
Making it this far. What a great question. Well, I think you can't say anything but prayer.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, the life that we live is a supernatural grace.
Yeah.
But it's also a decision that I made, and that I made after many years of discernment. 10 years of discernment. I mean, I've now spent as many years as a priest as I did in discernment before. A real attitude of the fact that this is the choice that I made.
Yeah.
I stood on the altar on the day of my ordination before God and before my family and friends, and I made a promise that I had thought about and discerned very clearly with full knowledge and free will. And does that make it easy? Does that make it easy at the end of a long weekend if I'm in the presbytery on my own? Or does that make it easy if I'm walking down the street and an attractive woman crosses the road in front of me? No, it doesn't make it easy, but I have made a choice. Yeah. And I had this conversation with my family once, because they spoke about the fact, well, if you ever get to a point where you're not happy, you could always leave. And I said, would you say that to me if I was a husband with 3 children and a wife at home, and I decided to fall in love with my secretary at work? No, you wouldn't. And the vows that I made before God and before you are just as serious, and I take them with just as much responsibility. So to a certain degree, that helps. That helps in the sense that I've made my commitment as a man and as a man of God. I live to live that out each and every day. Yeah. So, and how is that done? That's done by prayer. It's done by good, healthy friendships, both with men and with women. I've got lots of good Catholic families that I visit on a regular basis, and there's one family in particular, they might even be listening to the podcast, that I go and I spend a week of my holidays with, and a week of holidays with them and their children is enough to make me sort of appreciate again the great gift. But they're not in contrast to each other, they support and nourish each other. So good husbands and wives, good friends, good families make good and holy priests. And good and holy priests who are faithful to our vocation are also there to nourish and support families. And I think the other big thing, and it's probably not as easy to find at the moment, but is good and faithful religious women. Nice. I'm always inspired by the commitment that religious women make to the life of the church and the sacrifices.
The brides of Christ.
Yeah. So there are a few of my things. We're all out of time.
I'm
not going to ask you any tricky questions.
Thank you, and thank you for your priesthood.
Thank you, Jaycee, for your commitment to the seminary, the Mutual Appreciation Society here. As we wrap up, we are coming back next week and to episode 3, and we're going to be looking at what it means to have a good spiritual plan of life, what it means to sort of discern, and some really good tips as to what we need to do in the discernment process.
It will be interesting.
Exactly. How do we listen to God's voice, and how do we know, and this is a really important one, how do we know that it's God's voice speaking to us and not the evil one? How do we discern between the good and the evil spirits? So we might finish this with a simple prayer. This is a prayer that Father Brennan suggests from Father Charles de Foucault, and it's the prayer of abandonment. Father, I abandon myself into your hands. Do with me what you will. Whatever you may do, I thank you. I am ready for all. I accept all. Let only your will be done in me and in all your creatures. I wish no more than this, O Lord. Into your hands I commend my soul. I offer it to you with all my love of my heart. For I love you, Lord, and so need you to give to myself, to surrender myself into your hands without reserve and with boundless confidence. For you are my Father, Amen. Thanks everyone for listening. If you're listening live, you can always follow us on Apple, in the Apple Store, or also at Google Play, and also on the YouTube channel. If you are listening live tonight and you're from the Archdiocese of Melbourne or the Archdiocese of Adelaide here in Australia, join us for our after show Zoom catch up. You should have the details already. If you don't, you can send a Facebook message to Catholic Vocations for the Archdiocese of Melbourne, and we'll send you through those details, and that'll start promptly at 8:40 this evening. Okay, thanks everyone. God bless. Have a good night.